The Canadian Shield. A vast, unforgiving expanse of wilderness that holds secrets older than time. Tonight, we delve into a tale that began in the heart of this wilderness, in the year 1870. A tale of friendship, betrayal, greed, and a gold mine so immense, it seemed blessed, or perhaps, profoundly cursed. What happened to these two men, two best friends, remains a chilling mystery. What tragedy happened is still unknown as we speak. Was it avarice that drove them into darkness, or some far sinister force at play in the wilderness? Before we venture further, a quick note. If you're drawn to stories that explore the shadowy corners of history, the unexplained, and the downright unsettling, then you've found your tribe. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and let's uncover these mysteries together. We're going to explore the story of what happened to those two best friends in 1870 and what sinister tragedy struck them that caused this seemingly incredible discovery to turn into a tragedy. The biting wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Frank Lemon, a man hardened by years of prospecting, urged his horse forward. It was early spring, 1870, but the Canadian wilderness held on to winter with a stubborn grip. Behind him snaked a line of a dozen other men, all hired by the ambitious, wealthy Lafayette French. French, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and resentment in the rough-and-tumble mining towns, had one singular obsession: gold. He had promised a handsome cut to whomever could find him a mother lode, a vein of gold big enough to bankroll a full-scale mining operation and engrave their names in history. It was this promise that compelled Frank to convince his best friend, a charismatic gambler known only as Blackjack, to abandon his saloon table for the untamed wilds. Weeks they had ridden, weeks of sifting through riverbeds, chipping at rocks, and enduring the relentless elements. Hope was beginning to dwindle, replaced by the gnawing hunger of disappointment and the creeping dread that French's dreams were nothing but fool's gold. As the column of men plodded along the North Saskatchewan River, its icy waters reflecting the grey sky, Frank's gaze drifted towards the dense forest bordering the riverbank. He was done, frustrated, and ready to cut his losses. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about the warm, cozy feeling he had sitting back in his small hometown. That's when he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible trail disappearing into the trees. A path worn by something other than the river's relentless flow. An inexplicable pull tugged at him, a feeling that this barely there trail might lead to something more than more rocks and disappointment. For too long, he told himself, they had been blindly following the river, as though the gold was only to be found in the water. Maybe the true treasure lay hidden within the heart of the wilderness. Frank reined in his horse, its hooves crunching on the frozen ground. He turned to address the others, to share this hunch, this sudden surge of hope, but found that they had continued onward, their heads bowed against the wind. All, save for Blackjack, who lagged behind with a knowing glint in his eye, had left. Frank's initial frustration quickly dissolved. This was a blessing. He'd grown tired of the company. Without a word, he gestured towards the trail, a silent question passing between the two friends. Blackjack grinned, a flash of white teeth against his weathered face, and nodded. "Let's see where it goes, Frankie," he said. They turned their horses towards the trees, leaving the others behind, and the trail beckoned them deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the weak sunlight, the air growing colder and stiller with each step. Hours passed. The trail twisted and turned, ascending gentle slopes and winding around fallen logs. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic beat of hooves and the occasional call of a distant bird. But something wasn't right. Frank felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a sense of being watched. He began to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like the wind rustling through the leaves, but somehow wrong. Like voices barely audible. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the others, perhaps realizing their mistake and returning. But there was only Blackjack, his expression unreadable. "Hear anything, Blackjack?" Frank asked, his voice a little too loud in the quiet forest. Blackjack paused, tilting his head. "Now that you mention it, yeah, kinda. Like someone breathing down your neck." But when they both peered behind them, there was nothing but trees and shadows. They dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps their imaginations playing tricks on them after weeks in the wilderness. But the whispers persisted, growing more insistent, more defined. Frank imagined Blackjack was beginning to sweat, not wanting to admit that the experience was beginning to affect him. They pressed on, deeper and deeper, the feeling of unease growing stronger with each passing mile. Finally, the trail led them to a small, crystal-clear stream, gurgling over smooth stones. They dismounted, their horses gratefully drinking from the cool water. As Frank knelt to fill his canteen, his eyes widened. Gleaming in the sunlight, nestled amongst the pebbles, were nuggets of gold. Not dust, not flakes, but substantial nuggets, glittering with promise. His heart leaped. Could it be? Had they stumbled upon the mother lode? He grabbed Blackjack's arm, his voice hoarse with excitement. Blackjack, look. Blackjack stared into the water, his jaw dropping. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, I'll be damned, Frankie. We actually found something. But Frank, despite his elation, felt a surge of caution. Hold on. Let's not celebrate yet. This could be just a pocket. We need to find the source. They followed the stream upstream, their excitement growing with each step. The nuggets became more plentiful, larger, the water shimmering with a golden hue. Then, they saw it. A rocky ledge, where the stream cascaded down, revealing a sight that would forever be etched in their memories. Embedded in the rock were veins of gold, thicker than their arms, gleaming like molten sunlight. A veritable mountain of gold. A king's ransom. More wealth than they could ever imagine. For a moment, they were speechless, frozen in awe. Then, the dam broke. They whooped and hollered, jumping up and down like children, slapping each other on the back, their laughter echoing through the trees. But as the initial euphoria subsided, a heavy silence fell. The weight of their discovery settled upon them. They had found what they were looking for, but now came the hard part. The dilemma. The choice that would change their lives forever. Frank and Blackjack, despite their adventurous spirits, were bound by a contract to Lafayette French. They had signed on as prospectors, agreeing to share any findings in exchange for a cut of the profits. Reporting this discovery meant a comfortable life, a generous payout, but only a fraction of the true wealth that lay before them. The alternative was far more tempting, far more dangerous. They could conceal the find, keep the gold for themselves, and become richer than their wildest dreams. It would require secrecy, deception, and a constant fear of discovery, but the reward was immeasurable. It was a risk, but a risk worth taking, Frank thought. He looked to his friend, and saw the dilemma playing on Blackjack's face. "This is big, Blackjack," Frank said, his voice low. "Bigger than anything we've ever seen. We can't just rush into this." Blackjack nodded slowly. "Agreed. We need to think this through. Sleep on it. Let's make a decision in the morning." They agreed to make a decision the next day. They left the stream and set up camp in a small clearing nearby, the golden promise of the mine hanging heavy in the air. Blackjack went to gather firewood, leaving Frank alone to set up the tent. As he hammered in the tent pegs, the whispers returned, louder now, closer. Frank spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the growing feeling that they were not alone. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind or the rustling of leaves, but the feeling persisted. Something was watching them, listening. He was spooked to the extent that he thought about just leaving altogether. Frank shook it off, attributing it to nerves and exhaustion. He needed to focus. He had a decision to make. Later, as they sat by the crackling fire, the aroma of boiling coffee filling the air, Frank voiced his true feelings. "Blackjack, we'd be fools to tell French," he said, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Why settle for a measly share when we can have it all? We can be set for life." Blackjack stared into the flames, his expression troubled. "It's not right, Frankie," he said softly. "We made an agreement. Besides, what if someone gets hurt? This feels wrong somehow." Frank exploded. "Hurt? What's wrong about setting ourselves up for life? Who are you thinking will get hurt, Blackjack? You're being ridiculous." The argument escalated quickly, fueled by greed and resentment. Frank saw his dream slipping away, hijacked by Blackjack's stubborn morality. Blackjack saw the darkness creeping into his friend's eyes, the dangerous allure of unlimited wealth twisting him into someone he didn't recognize. Finally, Blackjack stood up, his face etched with disappointment. "I can't do it, Frankie. I won't lie, I won't cheat. I'm going to bed." He turned and stomped towards the tent, disappearing inside. Frank watched him go, his anger simmering. He couldn't believe Blackjack was being so naive, so blind to the opportunity before them. He paced around the fire, his mind racing, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "He's going to ruin everything," he muttered to himself. "He's going to tell French. I can't let him do that." Eventually, exhausted and frustrated, Frank went to the tent himself. He crawled inside, careful not to disturb Blackjack, who was already asleep, his breathing deep and regular. But Frank couldn't sleep. He lay there, staring at the canvas, listening to Blackjack's snores, the anger and resentment building inside him like a pressure cooker. As he lay awake, he couldn't help but start to think that Blackjack was an obstacle to his greed. He laid there thinking about all the reasons why he couldn't let Blackjack live. He laid there thinking about all the possible solutions, and soon Frank snapped. Frank had crossed the line, crossed the threshold, and suddenly, Frank didn't see his best friend anymore. He saw an obstacle. Dark thoughts began to consume him. Thoughts of silencing Blackjack permanently. Thoughts of eliminating the threat to his newfound wealth. The whispers seemed to feed on his growing darkness, urging him towards a terrible act. Finally, he could take it no longer. He was going to deal with this, once and for all. In a trance-like state, Frank rose from his sleeping bag, his movements slow and deliberate. He crept out of the tent, his eyes fixed on the axe leaning against a nearby tree. He grabbed it, the cold steel heavy in his hand. He returned to the tent, his heart pounding, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. But the darkness had taken hold. He raised the axe above his head, his hands shaking, and with a primal scream, he brought it down on Blackjack's skull. The sound was sickening, the finality brutal. Blackjack's snoring stopped abruptly. Frank stood there, frozen, the axe dripping with blood, the whispers rising to a crescendo. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He stumbled out of the tent, collapsing by the fire, his body trembling, his mind reeling. What had he done? He had murdered his best friend. He was a monster. The weight of his actions crashed down on him, suffocating him with guilt and horror. But as he sat there, consumed by remorse, a twig snapped in the darkness near the tent. Frank's head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. "Who's there?" he croaked. A low, guttural moan emanated from the tent, a sound of unimaginable pain and suffering. It was Blackjack's dying breath, but wrong, twisted, unnatural. Frank stared at the tent, paralyzed with fear. The moaning grew louder, closer, as though something was dragging itself towards him. Then, the whispers turned into voices. Clear, distinct, malevolent. "You will pay for what you have done," they hissed. "You will suffer for eternity." A wave of icy dread washed over Frank, a feeling of pure, unadulterated terror. The moaning intensified, reaching a fever pitch, and then, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the forest, a scream of unimaginable agony. It was Blackjack, but not Blackjack. Something else had taken hold. Frank didn't wait to see what. He leaped to his feet and ran, blindly, desperately, towards his horse. He scrambled onto its back and spurred it into a gallop, fleeing through the trees, the screams and whispers chasing him into the abyss. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. Hours he rode, his horse stumbling through the darkness, the whispers nipping at his heels, the feeling of being hunted growing stronger with each stride. He could feel the presence behind him, watching, waiting, vengeful. Finally, as dawn began to break, he burst from the trees, emerging into the small town he and the others had passed through weeks before. The whispers stopped abruptly, the feeling of pursuit vanished. He was alone. But the terror remained, etched into his soul. He rode straight to the church, collapsing on the steps, waiting for the priest, desperate for salvation. When the priest arrived, Frank poured out his story, a jumbled mess of gold, greed, murder, and the vengeful ghost of Blackjack. The priest listened, his face growing pale, his eyes widening with a mixture of horror and something else. Initially, he dismissed it as the ravings of a madman, the hallucinations of a guilty conscience. But as Frank described the gold mine, its location, its immensity, something changed in the priest's eyes. The horror faded, replaced by a gleam of avarice, a hunger for wealth that consumed him. He thought that Blackjack had found a way to influence Frank. His spirit had attached to the man that had done the unthinkable. "I will help you, my son," the priest said, his voice strained. "But you must leave this place. Now. Go far away, and never return. I will take care of Blackjack's remains, give him a proper burial. That will appease his spirit." Frank, desperate for forgiveness, did as he was told. Fleeing the town, leaving the priest to grapple with his conscience and his newfound greed. The priest, however, had no intention of appeasing any spirits. All he could think about was the gold. He enlisted the help of John McDougall, a trusted friend and seasoned outdoorsman, tasking him with locating the mine and securing it for themselves. John, initially hesitant, was swayed by the priest's promises of wealth and power. He ventured into the wilderness, following Frank's directions, and soon found the campsite. The scene that greeted him was gruesome. Blackjack's body still lay in the tent, the axe protruding from his skull. But as John began the grim task of burying the body, the whispers began. Faint at first, then growing louder, more menacing. He tried to ignore them, attributing them to the wind or his imagination, but they persisted, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He buried Blackjack in a shallow grave, piling stones on top to mark the spot. Then, driven by the priest's instructions, he went in search of the gold, following the stream upstream. But the whispers intensified, accompanied by chilling laughter, a sound that seemed to penetrate his very soul. John, a man who had faced down bears and braved blizzards, was terrified. He abandoned the search and fled back to town, his mind haunted by the voices and the laughter. Despite his terror, the lure of the gold proved too strong. After a few days of drinking to calm his nerves, John convinced himself that it had all been his imagination. He returned to the forest, this time with a group of men, seeking safety in numbers. But when they reached the campsite, they found something even more unsettling. The stones that had marked Blackjack's grave were gone, vanished. And the tent, the bloody tent, had disappeared without a trace. It was as though the campsite had never existed. John, his resolve shattered, knew that something was terribly wrong. The whispers, the laughter, the missing grave, it was all too much to ignore. He and the others fled, never to return. John himself never recovered, succumbing to alcohol poisoning a few weeks later, his mind tormented by what he had seen and heard. John's death marked the beginning of a series of tragic events, each linked to the cursed gold. The priest, after learning of John's fate, ventured into the wilderness himself, only to be consumed by a raging forest fire. Lafayette French, obsessed with the mine, hired guide after guide, each one meeting an untimely end. He said the mine was just around the corner. French himself eventually found the mine, or so he claimed in a final letter home. But before he could reveal its location, his cabin burned to the ground, and he perished in the flames. The stories of Blackjack's ghost, the whispers, the laughter, the string of deaths, they all combined to create a legend. The legend of the cursed gold. A treasure guarded by vengeful spirits, forever out of reach. To this day, prospectors and treasure hunters still venture into the Canadian Shield, drawn by the lure of Lafayette French's lost gold mine. Some dismiss the stories as folklore, the product of overactive imaginations and the dangers of the wilderness. But others, they hear the whispers. They feel the presence. They sense the chilling touch of Blackjack's curse, still lingering in the shadows, a reminder that some treasures are best left undisturbed. The gold mine, it is said, is still out there, just waiting for its next victim. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of the Canadian wilderness. If you enjoyed this tale, please leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with your friends. And as always, stay curious, and be careful what you seek, because you just might find it.